Happy Tuesday. The 10th anniversary, or the 10th week anyway, of the Political Geekfest, kicking off at 1 o'clock in the east coast of Australia anyway. At a moment where, if you look at what's happening elsewhere in the world, where the remarkable times just become more and more strange and scary. Before we get cracking, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land I'm on, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I know that you would all join me in paying my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that the land that we're all on in Australia has never been ceded. We've got a very exclusive club today. I think as this journey goes on, people are finding ways of getting out of the world again, and that's a good thing, but we've still got a great group of you joining us today to talk through the latest Guardian Essential Report with my good friend Paul Karp, who's subbing in today to share his insights as Catherine deals with a few life issues that I'm sure she'll share when she comes back into the chat over the next couple of weeks. If there is anybody who's not a regular, put your video on so we can see each other. Use the chat to ask questions. Make yourself at home. I can see Patricia there doing the knitting while she's listening. So that's the sort of thing that we love to see, that we're sort of part of your life and you're part of our life every day. I see Denise has actually got her camera on today, which means that she's not doing her exercises. So I'm sure we'll hear from her. And please participate in the conversation. You know, the reason that we set this project up 10 weeks ago now was that we thought that an anchor point for everyone's day would be a useful thing. And I've just been really proud of the way that this thing has emerged and grown. And, you know, yesterday we had some wonderful people, including Pat Dodson, talking about National Reconciliation Week. Tomorrow we're talking about class actions, and Thursday we're talking about the history of pandemics. So these discussions that you'd probably, you know, you might see a little bit of it flashing through your screen on Facebook if you use that, or you might read a snippet in the paper. It gives you a chance to, you know, dive in deep into issues. And this is a lovely platform for that, so that we don't need to book a town hall and try to get people to come out in the cold. You can sit there and do your knitting and be part of a public conversation about the sort of nation we're in. And so that's what we're doing today. And one of the guys that provides great context to the way that we look at Australia is the Guardian Australia's Paul Karp. And Paul, thanks for joining us today. I can see you're at your home too. And how's things been going for you over recent weeks?
Oh yeah, it's been all right. I've decided to adopt my foster greyhounds, so that's one thing that looked like it was going to be temporary during isolation that's going to become permanent. So, but yeah, life's getting back to normal. More and more in at Parliament. I mean, still socially distancing at press conferences, but Parliament's going to be back next week and the week after. So yeah, things are getting back to normal.
Well, have you felt a difference in the vibe around the place? Like, obviously, at the centre of the crisis, every bit of information that came out was, you know, people wanted to hear what was happening. They were relying on the media to give the information. Are you seeing any change in the way that issues are rolling out now that sort of some degree of normality has been restored?
Oh, absolutely. At the start of the COVID response, I would get texts from friends and family that don't normally watch press conferences, and they were hanging off every word because, you know, those press conferences were announcing, you know, what parts of economic and social life were going to be shutting down, whether, you know, they would need to go into work or you know, shut their small business. So it was all such, vital stuff. Whereas now, you know, the last National Cabinet press conference was about, you know, the future of federation reform, you know, COAG is no more, and National Cabinet will stay, and, you know, 5-year funding agreement on hospitals between the states and the Commonwealth. So important stuff, but, you know, people weren't hanging off every word in the same way that it was when they were waiting to find out what was being shut down or what was being reopened. Now I think there's more attention on the premiers as they announce things like, you know, gyms reopening in New South Wales, for example.
And they've also rediscovered the art of putting out the garbage. So the most busy time to be reporting in Canberra now is at about 5 minutes to 4 on a Friday.
Yes, there have been some stinkers of which, having to pay back $721 million, taken off people through the robo-debt program on Friday was the latest instalment. So, yeah, a long time coming. Activists and experts like Terry Carney complaining that program was illegal, and legal action finally being taken, but a big back down announced on Friday.
I'm going to dive into the slides now. For those that are regulars will know how awkwardly I do this. So we are going to share our screen and hopefully go into my deck, and people can nod if they can see that. And this week we've really looked at leadership approvals only because we've been sort of doing it on a monthly cycle. And we've also gone into some of the personality traits and asking people what they think of leaders today. And it really does reinforce the authority that Scott Morrison has been building up. So as you can see from this first slide, he's at 65% approval, 26% disapproval, 8% undecided, which is, pretty low as well. But if you had to characterize the past month for Morrison, Paul, it's almost as if he's built a protective layer now that these numbers don't get affected by the day-to-day political difficulties that can sort of cause a bit of bark on a leader. So obviously we were in the field before the robo-debt announcement, but the previous week there'd also been the admission of how badly they got the numbers wrong in calculating the job seeker and job keeper, or the job keeper demand. So, how do you characterise this journey with the Prime Minister?
Huge rebound since summer, and obviously quite a lot of support locked in and relatively stable. Yeah, not buffeted by the day-to-day. But, I think that the support is built on a surprisingly high proportion of Labor voters going for him, as they're having a favourable impression. And I guess the thing we have to see is whether that is linked to particular policies, whether people are only lending their support from Morrison because of programs like JobKeeper, and whether that changes when those are modified or withdrawn, or whether they have a more permanently favourable impression of him as a person, whether those things, they now find that he's trustworthy and that they will stick with him even as some of the supports are withdrawn.
I should bring in our King Geek, John Remington, who puts together the report each week for us on that partisan question, John. And what is the support amongst Labor voters there at the moment?
The support for Morrison amongst the Labour voters is pretty higher than we've seen it, or as high as we've seen it in previous weeks. He's got 53% support amongst Labour voters. Most of that is just at the slight approval rating. So we've got 45% of them saying they approve of him rather than strongly approving of him, where most of the coalition voters sit when there's 41% of them.
Now, I've put together a piece that's currently up in The Guardian that's, I feel it's getting a little bit of hate because I've tried to do something that, I should never do, which is be a bit satirical in the way that I've covered our polling. But I've kind of said that the wardrobe that Morrison's wearing, which is basically, something that looks very much like a Labor government wears, is sort of getting a few catcalls as he walks down the, what do you call it? When the models walk down the slipstream or whatever, the runway. Is this an extreme makeover for the Prime Minister, Paul, or am I totally mangling any form of metaphor here?
Well, a wage subsidy is something that you associate with a progressive party, but I think some of the more usual colours are coming back into the wardrobe recently, with suggestions that home improvements are going to get a big injection of money rather than social housing, for example. So perhaps he's reaching for a few more classic conservative pieces from his wardrobe. Yeah.
There is a point at which you feel that's going to break, and it's just at what point. But, you know, even the decisions he made over the last week, maintaining the National Cabinet and at least offering the ACTU access to a process around industrial relations, seems to reinforce to me that he actually gets that this current outfit is kind of working for him, the unifying leader. Now, this is the marketing guy who goes looking for, you know, the right message, and it feels to me that he's found it. So I'm not saying that he's had a Damascus-like conversion as either a person or a leader, but he knows what's working at the moment, and I just feel that he's holding on to that as long as he possibly can.
I think it's smart to have unions around the table, but the industrial relations process, I've got some sort of misgivings about, in that, you know, experts like Anthony Forsyth have said that the areas that they've chosen for reform are quite, you know, an employer-friendly wish list. So, it's possible that unions are, being invited to this, and then, will be invited to surrender, pay and conditions in the name of job creation. In which case, going along with it, they might be getting suckered into being blamed if not enough jobs are created, when perhaps that's the role of government and fiscal stimulus. So I think the jury's still out on that one, about whether it's going to be a genuine process that comes up with a lot of reforms, or just sort of window dressing about bipartisanship that actually sets unions up to fail.
Yeah, I take that point. But I would say on the IR, and let's just hang there for a moment, it's not like there's any great love for the current enterprise bargaining system amongst unions, and there's been unions that have had real problems with the degree of technicality around it. There's been a call for a long time for industry-wide bargaining frameworks rather than workplace-based bargaining. So I do feel there's something on the table that is worth talking about. And the other point I'm interested in your views on is this, that if you take my thesis that this bipartisanship, or the appearance of bipartisanship, is working for the Prime Minister, there is actually a cost in moving away from that for him. So it will be part of his, I think, decision-making matrix, if you like. The cost of breaking back into the old battles is actually these sorts of figures of 65% approval.
Yeah, and unions have already won one big concession, that the Ensuring Integrity Bill, which made it easier to deregister them or disqualify their officials, it is off the table now. But the sorts of improvements that they would most like to see, like industry-wide or multi-enterprise bargaining, I'm not sure that those are things that they're going to be offered in this process. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. Well, I guess the other part of this story has been the way that the Prime Minister's managed to marginalise his opponents, and it's not that the numbers are particularly bad for Anthony Albanese. It's just that he's been out of the picture to a degree because of the way the government's set up, the federal state structure. What's been your view from the ringside seats on how the opposition's been managing its way through the last few months?
Well, they've been trying to reproduce what was very successful during the bushfires, which is to make constructive suggestions, sort of front-running the policy development process. And they were sort of a long way ahead in the bushfires, but because the response to COVID-19 has been much better, they've tended to be arguing around the margins. JobKeeper should go to shorter term casuals, or there should be a package for the arts industry. And I think some of those things have turned out to be prescient, particularly the issue of casuals and part-timers who earn more on JobKeeper than their ordinary income. I think that's going to get a big look in from the government when they reviewed that program in June. But even those critiques of the programs, haven't been enough to seize a lot of attention. And yeah, obviously Anthony Albanese is not on national cabinet. Parliament hasn't been sitting very much, which is a usual arena to get some attention on the opposition. So yeah, they have lacked a bit of oxygen.
Yeah, and that sort of bears out in the preferred Prime Minister ratings. It was only 3 months ago that Labor was actually, or Anthony Albanese was ahead 40-35 as preferred Prime Minister, and you can just see that shift. Well, actually, sorry, go back to January, it was 39-36. I'm reading the wrong colours. Albo's yellow here, which is close enough to red. But the preferred Prime Minister numbers have really turned around over that period. The one other thing before we come up for air is this table we've put together, which is really, I think, more than any of those other numbers, illustrates the turn in fortune since January 20 for Morrison. Good in a crisis. If the bushfires was, the starting point of this, he's shifted the views of 1 in 3 Australians on his ability in a crisis, up 25% as a capable leader, 23% on understand the problems facing Australia. And these are sort of common benchmarks that are used across Western democracy as almost the core positives and negatives that people leaders need to be on top of to be electable. But you can just see significant movements in just about every one of those. The positives have all gone up double digits, the negatives have all gone down.
Yeah, and rating higher than Anthony Albanese on those positive attributes. But, the size of the change is so large because, as you've noted, coming off a low base over summer and getting marked down over summer for the handling of the bushfires. So it's a dramatic recovery.
And I know this sticks in the craw, this will stick in the craw of all progressives that, a Conservative leader is doing so well. But I actually, again, in the piece that I'm sure people will tear to shreds in The Guardian, say there are some silver lining in Morrison's success at the moment. Firstly, that, it's not like it's at the expense of the other side. Like, I think there is a sense that government is going well and the tide is rising for all boats. Secondly, I think that by governing to the centre, he's actually marginalised the worst excesses of his right-wing flank. He is working much more in concert with Dan Andrews than he is with George Christensen at the moment. And thirdly, it effectively is a Labor agenda. This government is running, at this point, Keynesian economics, supporting those in needs, intervening in industries where they're needed. So while, in the day-to-day contest of politics, at least I want to see progressives win because I think that in government they do more. I don't think this is all bad in that Morrison's being rewarded for the way he's governing at the moment.
Yeah, I think he's Keynesian to a point, but the jury's still out. The second there was that $60 billion underspend on JobKeeper, the instinct wasn't how can we help more people with that money. The instinct was, oh, we can save that and the debt won't be as large. And there's still this question of other than support for a few particular industries like construction, what is going to be available beyond September. So I think he's Keynesian. I think he's Keynesian to a point, but there is still like a lot of tests about whether or not he's governing from the centre, including energy policy. We really have to see what the policy development has been like once the conversation shifts off COVID-19.
Yeah, John, what's going on in the chat? Am I being torn to pieces yet?
Not yet, but give it time. There's been a couple of questions there just about that comparison between Morrison and Albanese. So in the essential report, and particularly because of the bushfires, we wanted to get a sense of the leadership of Morrison. We didn't feel it was the right time to get the sense of Albanese at the same time. So the last time we measured Morrison was in January. Last time we measured Albanese was in October. And that's the difference in the comparisons there. It is worth pointing out, though, that in January we did see a drop from October to January for Morrison, and it's done more than rebound. So where Morrison is now, and if you look on our website or the links from The Guardian, you can see he's in a better position than he was in October, and also obviously January when he's had that bounce back.
If people have got questions in the that they want to put into the chat, it'd be great to have a bit of a go now. I see Denise has been making a couple of really prescient comments about the role of the media in all this. Do you want to come online, Denise? Just because we don't get you on camera very often. Now you're going to have to hit unmute. Yeah, there you go.
Hello, hi everyone. Nice
Hi.
to face to face. Usually I'm not. Yes, I mean obviously I commentate often, perhaps at times to my detriment, about the mainstream, particularly the mainstream or the corporate media's coverage of our political landscape. And I think that that plays a massive role in the perception that Morrison has with the electorate right now. Those of us who actually follow politics and the news cycle on a day-to-day basis and see beyond that corporate mainstream media surface, see something very different to what's reflected in your survey results. To say the least, we see someone who is still, I think his true colours are starting to pop out again now. We also see the gaps in the stimulus and package that he's given. We see people queuing up for food. We see an economy that was already struggling before the virus and before the bushfires, and of course that's getting much worse. My concern, of course, as always, and anyone who follows me, is the mismatch between what we really see going on when we follow Parliament, when we follow estimates, when we follow speeches, and then how it's reported through the corporate media. And indeed, I think that that's somewhat reflected in your results.
Maybe, look, thanks for your comment. I guess I'd respond in two ways, and then maybe, given Paul doesn't work for the corporate media, he works for an organisation which is a trust that's set up to promote the interests of journalism. But one of the, polling is challenging. Like, I run these numbers and I get really good numbers for the Prime Minister. So do I go out there and say, oh, but it's not really true, people are being hoodwinked to thinking that? Or do we say, this is the world that's in front of us at the moment. The Prime Minister has steered the country through a process that's led to us not having massive deaths through virus and not having the sorts of division that we're seeing in other parts of the world, and people like what they're seeing. I think that these numbers actually set us up to say government does work, and it actually sets a really good framework for a progressive agenda moving forward. And to undermine that, I think, and to say it's not real, actually disempowers us a little bit. You can come back if you like. Re-unmute Denise. She wants to come back. Let's keep this going.
I don't disagree. I think that it is a reflection of what people are thinking. Something that I've often raised on these chats and directly with you a couple of times, Peter, is what I would like to see as part of any survey results. Now where we're getting people's political opinions, I would like to match that with their news sources. What are they reading? How are they getting these views? Anecdotally, I know when I speak to people about politics, I know what media outlets they're consuming by what they're saying back to me. Again, because I follow the news cycle daily, as most people will know, and follow, what's really going on. I think that would be a really interesting insight, is to understand where people are getting their views from.
And of course, a lot of people just get it from the vibe. Paul, do you see a big difference? You monitor the different bits of media every day. Do you see the story that The Guardian's telling at the moment vastly different to the story, say, The Australian or News Limited is telling at the moment?
Well, if we take the Prime Minister's outing at the Press Club on Tuesday last week as an example, I mean, my story on the Tuesday morning, I found the most important aspect of the speech to be the withdrawing. He was saying that economic supports are temporary medicine, and don't get used to the medicine. So he was laying the groundwork for job seeker and job keeper being wound down. Another significant aspect of the speech was the skills part of it, that he wants to reform the skills system. But really, there was no new money for skills. There was just, we're going to go back to a review that was done the previous year and add some conditions on skills funding to the states. And this job maker label, which is still, still just a label, awaiting some content. So, I think there was a difference in the way that it was presented, that most people focused on the job maker aspect rather than, well, hang on, he's actually preparing us for withdrawing government supports. So I think there is a difference. And, The Guardian ran a series talking about the cliff, about all the forms of payments and support that are due to end in September. Whereas, I don't see that issue as prominent in other media. That's going to be a really tough time for households and for the Australian economy. One thought experiment that I'll just conclude with is that, remember what the Australian did to the building at the education revolution under the Labor government, where every cost overrun was, got a run. How you could possibly build school halls all over the country without any of them having any cost overruns or complaints. It's just not possible. Whereas, if they go ahead with this plan about home renovations now, are we going to see, every time Mrs. Pebbles, has a cost overrun in the kitchen renovation, or, Joe Bloggs has to wait longer for a bathroom renovation? Is that going to be considered worthy of criticism and demonstrate that the whole stimulus program is a failure in the way that the building education revolution was presented?
Yeah. And look, I think that's a really interesting and largely unspoken element in the government's success, that there hasn't been coordinated interference at the way that they've been approaching the problem. So A, you've had the opposition largely on board with the broad thrust of where the government's been going, but B, particularly, News Limited has been very supportive of the government's efforts as well, almost to a fault. The other question I want to ask you, just about the vibe in the gallery, what's been the blowback on the whole Wuhan lab stuff that the News Limited papers pulled together, which now seems to be part of some global effort to run interference for Trump into the lead up to the presidentials?
Yeah, so the fact that the dossier was firstly just a bunch of clippings of public, news articles, and secondly that it wasn't Five Eyes intelligence, that, and thirdly that it was distributed by the US Embassy but not attributable to them. It certainly discredited the initial reporting by the Daily Telegraph, and everyone had a bite at it. Fairfax looked at it, the Financial Times, the ABC, my colleague Daniel Hurst, everyone when they looked into it found that the Wuhan lab aspect of it was beaten up within an inch of its life, in a way that allowed the journalist to get some play in the Fox, Fox channel in the US. So, yeah, a kind of right-wing ecosystem of media talking to itself, and then all of its competitors, fiercely debunking the value of that document.
Indeed. Look, we'll jump back into a few more tables and then come back up for a bit more of a general chat. Please put questions in the chat so that we can bring you into the discussion. And also, if you have got questions that you'd like us to put in next week's report and come back and talk to you about next Tuesday, let us know. John, there has been, we have tested media usage from time to time. Do you think what Denise wants is doable, that we could actually have a crosstab on support of the government and primary news source, or where are our problems in doing that sort of polling?
Yeah, I know it's a question Denise has posted a few weeks, and every week I look at it, and I would love to answer it. It is exceptionally complex. We do have a question which we do run, not regularly, but semi-regularly. And there's a few issues there. One of them is, first of all, people do use multiple news sources. So it isn't just people are reading a single newspaper, a single title, or watching a single TV channel. The proliferation of online sources, news distributors, Google, Facebook, family and friends as sources of information, all just add to the mix that this is very muddled. So to understand what the single point at which a news or a view is being filtered through all of that is very difficult. We sometimes do it, but yeah, it's not something we do regularly, and it might be something we try and decode and decipher over the next few weeks and months.
And one of the other issues is clearly that some people get their news through a feed on a Facebook or a Twitter. Just before we go back in, some of you, and I'll post this up in the chat while we're going through these slides, we put out a more detailed report on Twitter's, the Twitter ecosystems that are pushing the conspiracy theories yesterday. Some of you may have sat through the initial presentation from the guys from QUT about a month ago, but they put out their final report yesterday. So there was a piece up in The Guardian. There's also a broad report that I'll stick in the chat while we're going. But let's dive back into a few more numbers, Paul, and see if I can make it work without looking like a dill. And then we go to screen show and away we go. So this is another one we've been running over a period of time, the government's response. Very goods and quite goods down a little bit, neutrals and the baddies up a bit, but not a major change. But that maybe speaks to a little bit of a degree of fatigue and maybe a little bit of a blowback. And we've got some numbers to reinforce this on the failure of the maths, which sort of came through about 8 days ago. But it's still, closer to 70% than anything.
Yeah, and the federal leadership of the response had kind of receded, as it's now up to state to determine when to come out of the 3 stages. So, a slight peeling back of support, but it's hard to say whether that's just noise or what people are critiquing about the federal response there.
Correct. And a bit of a drop off in all state government responses this week. 5% isn't huge. 14% is big in South Australia, but it's a pretty small sample, John. But there's been a little bit of a downward trend on the states over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think the state aspect will become increasingly interesting as the staggered withdrawal and easing of restrictions comes into play. I'm not sure if we've still got this. Here it is. Yeah, we're still seeing quite relatively high percentage of minority of people thinking it's too soon to consider easing restrictions, and as been mentioned in the chat, the threat of second waves and cluster outbreaks, how the individual states deal with it. I think we might see a lot more differences over the next few weeks.
Yeah, I think that second wave, if a second wave occurs, I think some of these numbers will become a lot noisier. And there hasn't really been a lot of talk about that federally, has there, Paul? There's a sense that we're on this inevitable opening up and that this isn't going to sort of be a stop and start.
Well, Scott Morrison has started laying the groundwork by saying a second wave would not be, we're always going to have cases. There are always going to be some cases and hotspots, and that isn't justification for moving backwards in the three stage. So I think he's, all along he wanted the economic considerations and not shutting down the economy to be, as important as the health considerations. And as the health outcomes have outperformed expectations, he's now trying to avoid any backsliding in terms of what's open, even if there are more cases.
There's a little bit of a difference in people thinking it's too early to ease restrictions. Victoria is still, I wouldn't say significantly, but partly more conservative than New South Wales and Queensland there.
Yeah, and Dan Andrews has been the one making the argument publicly that we don't want a second wave most strongly. Keeping the schools closed for longer, easing restrictions, but still, if you can work from home, you have to work from home in Victoria. So it makes sense that, he's the leader there. He's the one making the argument most strongly that we can't ease off too quickly, that's a bit higher than the other states.
Yeah. And the other one that we looked at today or this week was the rounding error. What was it? $60 billion. How do you think this reflects on the government's credibility? Short answer, poorly, but not overwhelmingly so. So total 41% say it's a poor reflection, but 43% doesn't affect the government's credibility. And that's where I think they've been, able to get a little bit of a leave pass on this issue. And I think it's a complex issue, because if it had been an overspend, it would have far greater economic consequences. I do think that the idea that a gotcha with a big dollar figure at a moment like this isn't quite the political gold that it might appear on the surface, Paul.
Yeah, and it could just be that the people that said that this reflects well, or that it doesn't affect the government's credibility, maybe they were thinking, $60 billion less means we're in less trouble, or $60 billion less means we'll have less debt. So perhaps they're seeing the silver lining in that announcement. I was perplexed by, the 18 to 34 group actually had the most support, saying that this reflected well on the government. I would have thought that younger people are more likely to have missed out on JobKeeper, for example, through casual employment, short-term casual employment. So I thought they would be more cheesed off about this gap, but they actually had more support, saying that this reflected well on the government.
Yeah, in fact, I totally misread those figures and thought the 25% was the outlier, saying that it was a bad thing. So that just shows how you read the numbers, sort of based on what you think is going to come out the other end. The final question, on which of the following would you prefer the government use the $60 billion? It has previously been allocated. So we gave a number of options there just to get a bit of a temperature sniff: extend the financial schemes, broaden the JobKeeper scheme, or put the money towards reducing the debt. So the majority of people want it to be spent. I think that's the takeout, apart from older voters where it's a little bit different, but 55-45. When we say extend financial schemes, John, I'm taking that's extending the free childcare, the length of the job seeker package. Were they the main ones in that set of options?
So, yeah, it was JobKeeper, job seeker, and early childhood learning, and that was extended beyond their current end dates, which are in June and September. Broadening the JobKeeper scheme was in relation to including workers who aren't currently covered by it. And we gave some examples there.
Yeah. So there is a little bit of a partisan divide emerging there. So 57% of coalition voters saying bank the money, whereas, 63% of Labor voters saying let's keep investing in the economy. And I guess as we move to the next phase, they're the sorts of fault lines that are going to develop, Paul. And I think the difficulty for the government is that there's a sense that that $60 billion is lying on the table, that, they were prepared to spend it. So now I think there is a legitimate claim on that money to get us through this crisis.
Well, yes, and Michael Sukkar himself said, if there were only 3 billion people on JobKeeper, it would be a whole different story. And then when it turned out there were only 3.5 billion people on it, he had to backtrack a bit. Yeah, I think this is really this $60 billion is sort of the Rorschach test of, like the inkblot test of Australian politics, where it's like, the people that think lower debt will save it all, versus people that think that the budget should be counter-cyclical. So we're in the biggest contraction since the Great Depression. So spend. And I think this is a really good illustration of that.
Yeah, in the chat, there's been a bit of discussion also comparing where we are, which is how are we going to spend $60 billion with where America is at the moment, which is, that much burning every day at the moment by the looks of things. So again, to sort of round out the narrative, this isn't a bad problem to have.
No, it's not. And, fewer people being on the payment, might indicate that fewer businesses met that threshold of downturn and that, the economy isn't doing as bad as thought. So, no complaints about the reason for the underspend, but more questions about what to do with it now.
Excellent. Well, let's go to the room. There's been some really interesting comments and questions coming in. I might start off with Eric, if he's there and wants to have a bit of a chat about the bushfires.
Yes, hello, I am here.
Hi.
My question in a lot of webinars recently has been that people just aren't talking about the bushfires. They seem to be forgotten. I know the coronavirus is a really big issue, of course, and what's happened to the economy and also what's happened to people's lives. And we seem to have done well with that. But we're so incapable of dealing with climate. And this has been so effective as a way to forget Scott Morrison's failure during that, and the government's failure to deal with climate change. And the media seems to go along with it. Am I seeing it wrongly, or what are your comments about that anyway?
Paul?
Well, I think that the COVID-19, the pandemic is the problem that we're dealing with right now. So we write news, and the next bushfire season, I'm sure we'll get a lot. I'm sure there'll be a lot of attention on that, and that we'll write about that. But it's winter, the fires are out. The pandemic and the economic contraction just have more salience to people's lives at the moment, and that's part of the problem, is that climate change is the frog in the pot, boiling by very, very small degrees, and we as the media have to be able to do both. We have to be able to talk about something that is a huge immediate threat, like a pandemic and, mass unemployment. But we also have to be able to tell the longer term story about climate change, because we're reaching a point where, we're not going to be able to make a difference in slowing or stopping climate change. So, we've still been reporting on, the COVID Commission is considering plans to massively expand gas. We're still trying to keep a focus on it, but you have to be able to walk and chew gum and do both. One thing I would say is that the Eden Monero by-election is going to be particularly interesting on this point, because while the media attention had been more on COVID-19, it's possible that voters in that seat will care more about, how slow all levels of government have been in getting assistance to bushfire-affected regions, and we might find out that although it was, several months ago, rather than a current crisis, that people are more concerned by that. So it'll be an interesting electoral test.
Yeah, one of my questions is, I don't think it's just a case of the caravan moving on this time with the bushfires, Eric. I think we are going through a once in 100-year pandemic, and it was an amazing shock that did suck up all oxygen. Is Morrison lucky, Paul? Like, this is my question. Like, is Morrison just lucky, or do you give him credit for some of the calls he's made along the way over the last few months?
Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say, lucky when he had an incredibly, most leaders probably aren't wishing in their heart of hearts for, a global pandemic and to have to shut down the economy and put people out of work and suffer the greatest contraction since the Great Depression. But that said, once fate dealt him that hand, it is correct to observe that gave him a chance to redeem his performance in the bushfires, to immediately have a crack at a bigger crisis, and to demonstrate that he'd learned lessons. I think, if to the extent that he's lucky, I think the thing that he's lucky about is that the state governments, particularly Gladys Berejiklian and Dan Andrews, dragged him to a more comprehensive, shutdown to prevent the spread of COVID-19. I think that by setting up national cabinet, that was smart. But the actual decisions that came out of it, a lot of them were driven by the states, and I think he's lucky in that sense.
Got a question from Victoria around the revelations on the superannuation spending. Are you there, Victoria?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I've just been thinking for a while now that maybe Anthony Albanese hasn't taken the temperature of the times properly, and that his positioning as a kinder, gentler, more subtle leader of the Labor Party isn't resonating, and that in this visual social media age, that maybe it might be time for Labor to consider that they need to draft in a leader who is not exactly Paul Keating 2.0, but someone who is demonstrating the qualities that are resonating with people in this day and age. I have a suggestion, and I'm hoping that Labor take it up, and I think that the social commentator Friendly Geordies would be an ideal draftee into the Labor Party at the moment. He's intelligent, he's articulate, he knows how to cut through. And is there anyone that Labor already has in Parliament that maybe they could consider as this alternative leader? I'm sorry to say, because Albo is a good person. However, it's all about winning at the end of the day and getting Labor's message out there.
So, Paul, you're close to the ground in Canberra. Is there internal discussion about drafting Friendly Geordie into the Parliament with a view to making him leader quickly?
Not that I've heard, but maybe I'm off the beat and I'm missing the big story. He packs a punch on social media, but the other alternative Labor candidates are people like Jim Chalmers, who are also more of the conciliatory govern from the centre mould. So, muscling up by changing leader is not something that is top of mind at the moment.
But it's an interesting question. In a normal world where you've got a by-election coming up, if you don't win that, it will be the first time in 100 years that the government's picked up a seat in a by-election. It would normally get at least the media talking about this. It feels to me at the moment that people aren't really focusing on the opposition because it isn't the time to do so. Is that right? Or are there some murmuring starting to happen around the show, Paul?
No, I think that before the Super Saturday by-elections that Shorten was facing, Anthony Albanese was obviously positioning himself for the leadership in the event that Shorten, lost one or more of those seats. I don't think we're seeing that this time around, because even if, Fiona Cotvoys wins this seat for the Liberals, it will be very easy for Anthony Albanese to, attribute that to the fact that Morrison is at a record high because of the response to COVID. And, Albo's positioning has always been that it doesn't matter if you're leading for, 3 years worth of news polls or essential polls if you then, lose on election day. And, Labor won lots of by-elections under Bill Shorten and then still fell short on election day. So I think Albanese will be able to say, look, we're going to announce policy closer to the election. I've always said this is about where we are in 2021, 22, and it's just unfortunate that we had a member that had to resign for health reasons, and it wouldn't be fair to judge him on a government riding high because of COVID.
I think you're right. I think the one lesson out of the last political cycle was that, the adage that the only poll that matters is election day is probably true. We've purposely stopped putting out the horse race polling over the last 12 months because we thought the noise was getting in the way of these more interesting discussions. Although we are moving to sometime over the next 2 or 3 weeks, putting some numbers out there that show how things are moving. And without wanting to, fire our shots early, John, are we living in a world where it is like a 55-45 sort of political environment, or is the leadership a bit disassociated from the political vote at the moment?
Yeah, I think the leadership question, and we've had it in, and we've had it in for many years. There is there's a personality issue there, but in itself, it's almost an unfair question in the fact that we're asking to compare the ability to do a job of a man who's currently doing it to someone who isn't doing it. So I think there's always something of a bias there. In terms of the polling numbers themselves, yeah, we are, that's the situation we're in now. The performance of the government, the performance of Scott Morrison is having an impact on the voting results. But when we come to elections and things, we are talking individual single percentage points. So it's not as if there's a 2/3 majority at all.
And just from the chat, what are we going to be putting in the poll in the coming week? I know we were talking about having a look at some of the broader economic impacts of the change over the next period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think as we progress out in the past few weeks, we've been looking at the transition away from lockdown. And I think now we're going to start to look at some of the more longer term issues. And obviously anything topical, which we've got going on at the minute. So obviously the things which are happening in America is very salient to what's happening. And some of the discussions we've had in the chat today, second waves, future of national cabinet, industrial relations reform could all be things that we look at over the next few weeks.
Have you got any special requests, Paul, given that you've given us an hour of your time? We'll give you a polling question in your honour.
Are you going to ask anything about the Peace in Our Time industrial relations, accord process? Because I'd be very curious about what people make of that.
Excellent. And Denise has just put in the channel a link to the Friendly Geordie. So if you do want to go onto YouTube and encourage him to stand for federal parliament, the link is there. It's 5 to the hour. I feel like we're going to get ourselves an early mark because I've got to go and do a radio interview right at 2 o'clock to go over this all over again. But thanks everyone for coming today. Tomorrow, as I said before, we're having a look at class actions and the role they play in progressive politics with our friends and sponsors at Maurice Blackburn. And on Thursday, a fantastic discussion that will be led by Emma Dawson and Jay McCalman from Melbourne Uni about the history of pandemics. So keep coming back and keeping us company. And thanks particularly for Denise for putting it out to your troops today and turning the camera on for us. And everyone have a lovely rest of the day and just keep staying connected and staying safe and happy. But thanks everybody, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Thanks. Stay well, everyone.